The first question is something that's on a lot of people's minds these days. Mark writes, my nonprofit organization receives federal grant funding. In light of recent events, we are concerned about the reliability of these grants, and we have already experienced some delays. At what point should we be considering layoffs and shrinking our budget? Let me just say first, of course, we don't really know where this is headed, and are these going to be prolonged disruptions, or will this get resolved? A lot of this is unknown. I think you would agree. And I would also say these are the kinds of situations where getting advice from a number of different professionals and people with different perspectives and expertise is really helpful. Attorneys like me may be able to advise you on whether you have legal rights under these grants if funds are not coming through, although that's not my expertise specifically. They may be able to work with you if you do need to lay off or furlough employees, or look at whether you can get out of contracts that are tying up funds on other things. Communicating with your other funders and grantors tends to be helpful because they may be in a position to be flexible about their grants and help you free up funds. And just talking with other similar nonprofits to see how they are approaching these things, and maybe explore opportunities to join together on programs or even mergers or acquisitions. So there's a lot of good advice and people with expertise to consult. Mike, you and I have our own particular areas of expertise and perspectives, and you're largely on the fiscal strategy side, which I presume you're going to have thoughts about operating reserves and how to plan in an uncertain environment. So with that, to just get us started, what are your thoughts and how do you react to situations like this and clients who have these kind of questions?
Yeah, Ben, what goes through my mind is, where are the primary, risks involved and such. And I think you made two comments that we can hang our hat on. Number one, we really don't know where this is going. Yeah. And so that's a given versus, knowing that something's delayed for 2 weeks, a month or something, and what the outcomes could be. And number two, I pretty much think we can answer this question, that it's not a short-term change. One, we don't know where it's going, and two, how long it's going to be here, and we definitely don't know what it looks like on the other side. So with all those said in mind, I think the primary risk, and I know I'm biased towards this, is towards the financial fiscal side, and financial health. And we've talked a lot about that, financial health assessments and things and such. And there's one tenet, in accounting, finance, that we tend to fall back on a lot, which is this conservative approach. You've heard of conservative budgets, conservative plan. You do a strategic plan. You might do a best case, worst case, likely case. But we usually don't base our planning on the best case. And then I just think, not that we're hoping for the worst case, but because of the finances and the dollars involved, and there's so many unknowns, I think we have to go even more conservative. And I also think, put in a word for transparency. I like to come back to you on that. I think we should be as transparent as possible, on something that we don't know. So back to that, I think most organizations are at one or two spots. They've got financial health. They have operating reserves, as you mentioned before. Our key indicator, basically an overstatement of operating reserves is, our rainy day funds, and our emergency funds that we've built up. But there are also funds for the future for the organization. Or there's organizations that have virtually none or very little, or what we call less than 3 months of operating reserves, which is where we think, as we've discussed with the National Operating Reserve Initiative and some other studies, that if you have less than 3 months of operating reserves, less than one quarter of a budget put away, you're not in a very healthy position.
And that's a lot of nonprofits, these days. Yeah.
And so I think looking back over our careers, Ben, we've been through disruptions going back as far as 9/11, I like to go back to, and then 2008-9 banking crisis, and then COVID, and then inflation. Should I keep going? All these, what I call virtual hurricanes. The one thing I think, we were always conscious of was it took longer to recover than we expected, which means they weren't short-term events. And I think we got to assume that. And I always said, boy, maybe we dipped into operating reserves or used some funds that, you got to get back to a balancing point. So back to the question, and I really think it's a singular question, even though we stated as two parts. Part number one, should we downsize our staffing? And two, should we adjust our budgets? I look at it this way, budgets first. But for most nonprofits, it's not unusual for up to 70% of the budget to be in staffing and labor. When you fully load all the costs in there. You throw another 10 or 15% in for overhead, and the controllable costs in a lot of nonprofits are pretty small. The direct cost of an event or, out-of-pocket costs on a program or something, unless you're re-granting to other groups. So I think you've got to plan, you got to take a quick look. And as we stated in our metering out with operating reserves is that, yes, you're going to use some, but have a plan in place. You got to save some operating reserves for the future. You can't go negative or go underwater, and just say, hey, look, what do we really have out there? Do we have a little or a lot? If we have a lot, you don't want to overspend that either. I could get into the whole article, but sort of set some parameters on the conservative side. What we're going to use and get back. Probably going to have a lot of organizations have to pivot to, a smaller size until funding stabilizes.
So if I understand your main point there, assuming an organization with operating reserves at some level, there are approaches to meter out the operating reserves.
Yes.
You don't want to spend them all just to retain the staff and current budget as it is. Better to be conservative with how much is drawn down. And if that is not enough to maintain the organization at its current size, you're in a position of looking at layoffs and other items in the budget. Is that the basic concept?
Yeah, that's a concept. And to state it another way, assuming you have some operating reserves, you don't have none, then you have nothing to dip into. But you're looking at, I hate using this word when it comes to operating. You're looking at your savings, what's there, and what do we say is we can use in the short term, and what are we saving for the future? What are we not dipping into? And such. Now, we have organizations, I will say this, I don't want to sound callous. If they have a concentration funding risk, where most of the funding is coming in from one or two sources, and one of those sources is either cut off, delayed, or something, you can almost forget what I'm saying. It's very tough. Really tough. And I just haven't, it's been a lot of tough conversations with a lot of organizations, and even organizations that aren't directly affected. It's affecting their, almost like a consumer confidence. And I've heard people say, hey, we get all our funding from a private foundation. They're already set up. They have their endowment set up and all that. They're just as nervous. Even though it doesn't affect them, they're looking at what the impact might be on inflation, interest rates.
And they might have a number of grantees coming to them, all asking for help.
They could have a lot of that too. Very good point. In general, during times of uneasiness, they're going to be a little more conservative in their allocations or something. Some of these groups are already trying to step up and fund extra, and that's great, but they're not going to be able to do that forever. And so it's all going to affect everybody. So I think we have to, say, I don't rely on grant funds, or I don't rely on that. It's going to affect a lot of, it might affect you on the other supply side, which is maybe your constituent needs that you're serving are going to grow.
Right. And I presume if you've not built up kind of diversity in your funding sources, you have little choice but to kind of get right on those efforts and try to bring in funds from other places. That probably doesn't solve your bottom line conclusion about whether you need to do layoffs now. But do you agree? There's a role, and you probably might not have much choice.
Yeah,
in the short term.
You're not looking at trying to bring in other funds, but that's always a semi-intermediate to long-term aspect. You can't just flip on a switch and funds are going to come in. And there might be, like during COVID, there were some grants and things, that were, I haven't seen much in the way of, except for some foundations providing, where there's like something you can apply for to get through this event.
Right.
too much. So I think, Ben, I think this really, because it's so a tough subject, the only thing you can do is, number one, sit down and do the planning, even though it's hard.
Mm-hmm.
And do a couple of them, like, what's the worst case that we lose this grant for a while? I mean, like more than a year.
Right.
And say, hey, where's the equilibrium? And then
Mm-hmm.
how much out of our savings can we use to get to the equilibrium? Because it takes time to downside of staff or make budget changes and
Right.
such, and try to make that movement, as we stated before, in about 90 days, in about a quarter, because I think this is
Mm-hmm.
going to be here. And if it's going to be around for a long time, you got to get to that equilibrium pretty quick.
Right. And it seems to me from your past writings, Mike, couple tools could be very useful here. One is your rolling budgets, every, what was it, 3 months back during the pandemic,
Right.
that you were recommending. And two is the tool to look at your funding sources and assess whether
Right.
they're reliable, they're shaky. We can put links to that under. But do
Exactly.
you agree? Are those
Yeah.
the
Both.
big parts of the toolkits?
Yeah, let me go back. There's two separate ones. The financial health assessment, which we've updated recently, is out there, and that really just helps you to, like, where has our funding going, but where are we going? And it helps you to assess operating reserves all on one sheet of paper, and you can share that with your boards and share it with yourself and go through it a little bit. The other one was during COVID, because it was happening so quick. We've always been an advocate for multi-year budgets. We cycled that back to be multi-quarter budgets because things were changing.
Right. Right.
And we've even seen that, Ben, and I think, well, we could end here, where I talked to a couple individuals and they said, we have grants that got hung up immediately, and then the funds got turned back on. But we feel like some of these funds are most likely not going to continue pretty soon. So on a quarter by quarter basis, you're starting to do a 4-quarter look, because to wean yourself off of, even groups that are sitting on a ton of operating reserves, if they're going to have a lower, balanced budget, size of budget, whatever you want to call it, lower, the pipelines of revenue is going to be down for a while. Figure out where you think that pipeline is going to last, because we're usually not guessing on the expense side. It's always the funding.
Right.
Figure out,
Right.
Where that most likely will be, and then how you can balance the budget, and then give yourself, 90 days, maybe 180 days, 6 months to try to get there, depending on, how many reserves you're sitting on. Last thing I'd like to say, Ben.
Right.
And this is a little callous, but I'd like to say, an organization that's built up 3 years of operating reserves, 30 months worth of operating reserves is great. But on a time like this, you could burn through those, 30 years worth of reserves in 30 weeks.
Right.
Right. A huge funding source. And then, it took so long to build those up, nickels and dimes at a time.
Right.
It's, that's why if you do deplete these, they're not going to go right back in the next year or two.
Right. So careful with the operating reserves. Be thoughtful about metering those out. And then back to this point you started with, be conservative with your expectations. Okay. This is not a time to be aggressively optimistic, and quarter by quarter budgets, and that will give you the best way to analyze where you're headed and what kind of cuts are needed.